Now, before we proceed to mathematical proofs, let's first take a look at arguments that involve only compound proposition. And then, we will define what it means for an argument involving compound proposition to be valid. How do we define that a certain argument is valid? And then after that, we will introduce a collection of rules of inference in propositional logic. Now, let's define first, ano bang ibig sabihin ng rule of inference? What is the purpose of rule of inference? So the purpose of rule of inference is to deduce new statement from statements we already have. And then these are templated for constructing valid arguments and are our basic tools for establishing the truth of statements. So these rule of inference are among the most important ingredients in producing valid arguments. So ito talaga yung gagamitin natin. Now, let's proceed to valid argument in propositional logic. Consider the following arguments involving propositions. If you have current password, then you can log onto the network. You have a current password, therefore, you can log onto the network. Here, we would like to determine whether this is a valid argument. That is, we would like to determine whether the conclusion, you can log onto the network, must be true when the premises, if you have a current password, then you can log onto the network, and you have a current password are both true. So again, I would like to highlight ano ba yung mga parts of this argument. So the first two sentences, we call this premise or premises. So an argument can have two or more premises. And then the last sentence after the word therefore is called the conclusion. Okay, now let's proceed. Before we discuss the validity of this particular argument, we will look at it by using propositions, or we will look at it by using propositional variable. We're going to come up with its form using propositional variable. We are going to represent each of these propositions with variable. So let's say if you have a current password, we will represent this with proposition P. And then you can log onto the network, that will be represented by proposition Q. So you have a current password. This is the same with the first proposition. So this is also P. And then the conclusion, you can log onto the network. This is proposition Q. Now, this argument has the form of P implication Q. So how do I came up with this form? So it is from if you have a current password. So that is if P, then Q. So this is if P, then Q, right? And then we're going to write here P because P represents you have a current password. And then therefore, so that will be a line. And then dito isusulat nyo yung symbol for therefore. Ang symbol for therefore is like this. A parang triangular period, tatlong period na naka-form into triangle. And then after that, you're going to write here the conclusion, which is here in our argument, Q. Okay. You have to note that, okay, in particular, when both P implication Q and P are true, so kapag true ang dalawang premises natin, so this is true, and this is also true, the conclusion must also be true. So this is a valid argument. So kanina ko pa yan sinasabi. na if all of the premises are true, then technically the conclusion is also true. That is a valid argument. Now, what happens when we replace P and Q in this argument form by propositions where not both P and P implication Q are true? So, ibig sabihin, what if isa sa mga premises false ang iyahang truth value? So, let's consider the following arguments involving proposition. Okay. So, the argument we obtain by substituting these values of P and Q into the argument form is like this. So, we already know that P is you have access to the network. Q represents you can change your grade. So, this is what we obtain after substituting this value. Okay. So, if you have access to the network, then you can change your grade. So, let me draw here. This is P, and then this is Q. You have access to the network. This is also P. And you can change your grade. This is Q. Okay. And then, our P here is true, right? So, let me rewrite na lang the form here sa side para mas klaro siya. P implication Q. Okay, hindi masyado maklaro yung therefore. But anyways, so accordingly here, what if one of the premises is false, right? So here, our P is true. However, our P implication true is false. So, the argument we obtain here seems valid, right? But, because one of the premises, namely, the first premise, itong P implication Q, is false, we cannot conclude that the conclusion is true. Most likely, this conclusion is false talaga yan siya. So, basically, in our discussion, para ma-analyze natin ang argument, we have to replace propositions by propositional variables first. So, this changed an argument to an argument form. So, we saw that yung validity of an argument follows from the validity of the form of the argument. So, we summarize the terminology used to discuss the validity of arguments with our definition of key notion. Okay, so just a review. So, I already have defined the words proofs, argument, valid argument kanina, right? So, just a review lang. An argument in propositional logic is a sequence of propositions. And then, all but yung final proposition in the argument, lahat din sila called premises. Tapos, yung final proposition, it is called the conclusion, right? So, an argument is valid if the truth of all premises implies that the conclusion is true. So, I have mentioned kanina the word argument form. So, ano ba yung argument form? An argument form in propositional logic is a sequence of compound propositions involving propositional variables. When I say a sequence of compound proposition, kasunod-sunod or step-by-step na compound proposition which nag-i-involve siya ng propositional variables. So, an argument form is valid no matter which particular propositions are substituted for the propositional variables in its premises. So, the conclusion is true if the premises are all true.